early
You'll
days.
ask the questions.
Yes, yeah. If you could let us know a little bit about the early introduction to flying and the inspiration and the lead into later exploits.
Well, it really all started when I was 5 years old. It's a long time ago, and it was when Alan Cobham brought a sort of flying circus down to Lowestoft just after the First World War, giving trips in an old Avro aeroplane it's a biplane with lots of struts and wires and things, and he landed at a playing field in Corton, North Lowestoft, and my father took my sister and I over because seeing an aeroplane in those days was very, very unusual, and we looked at this aeroplane and he finally decided he'd give us a 5-shilling trip each. So my sister got into the back seat of this marvellous aeroplane and I sat on her knee, and we went for a flight round Lowestoft, and when we landed, I suppose even at 5 years old, I thought, well, this is pretty marvellous, and I liked the smell of it and everything, the noise, and so I was pretty hooked, and from then onwards I wanted to learn to fly. And a few years later, when I was about 8 or 9, they returned, and this time I had a slightly more modern biplane, and were giving aerobatic flights, and I remembered looping the loop in this aeroplane, and I also remember I was going to a preparatory school then, telling my schoolmates that I'd done this, and I was ostracised for boasting because they thought I'd never done it, and so I've sort of given up talking about myself too much after that. Anyway, that went on, and I went through school life, and I was lucky enough to go to a boarding school, and again, my whole idea, my career was going to be in the Royal Air Force, and the idea was to be an officer and to fly, and possibly, if possibly, fly a single-engine fighter aircraft. And I got through my, as it was then, the matric, as it was like a school certificate, matric, and then went into the upper sixth of the school and did the whole entrance exam for Cranwell. By the time I was 16 and a half, 17, and ready to leave school, my father very wisely said, I think you better have a medical. And I thought, well, I'm very fit. The school I was at was a swimming school. We swam every day, and I was in 2 polo teams, and I did a lot of swimming and diving. And so he took me up to London and made an appointment at a Dastrel House in London, and the Royal Air Force medical team gave me the look over. At that time, Anthony Eden was Foreign Secretary, and he started the League of Nations, which was, we're now talking, 1934, and of course all the countries were disarming, including ours. I only found out this later, they were only taking 1 cadet in 100 for Cranwell. And so it wasn't a great surprise, I suppose, in later life when I realised that I was failed through my ear test. I got through all the other tests, all except ear, nose and throat. And the group captain doctor failed me on my hearing because it was found that I had a damaged eardrum through probably early swimming. Anyway, that was that, and a terrible disappointment. My father took me to 2 Harley Street specialists the day after, and they could do nothing for me. They just said the eardrum is virtually ruptured and gone. And so I was more than disappointed, and time went on, and I went into my father's business rather reluctantly, and after a year or 2, after which I tried short service commissions, and again I failed the medical. We're getting up now to 1936, and finally in 1937 one of my friends, I was then working at Watford near London, said that at Luton they were starting a new thing called the Volunteer Reserve Air Force, and they were open for cadets going in at Luton. And so duly I went along, and not thinking for one moment that I'd get through the medical, and of course I swam through it. In fact, I was the first cadet actually to learn to fly at Luton, and that, of course, Luton now being a huge busy airport, was then just a field with rather a bad slope on it, grass, no runways of course, and it was owned by a firm called Percival, who made aeroplanes of one sort and another. One or two of them, I believe, won the King's Cup air race, but anyway, they had a hangar there, and so we were introduced to aeroplanes like the new Magister, which was a low-wing monoplane trainer. I didn't actually learn to fly on Tiger Moths like many people did later, but at any rate, this seemed to satisfy it, and I managed to go solo fairly reasonably quickly, and then after a bit went on to Hawker Harts, which were old fighter bombers used in the Middle East, and they put instead of the gunner seat at the back, they put another cockpit with dual controls, and so the instructor could sit there and watch all the mistakes I was making in the front. Anyway, it wasn't long afterwards that the job of duty pilot at this particular flying school came into being, and I put in for it and got it immediately, which meant that I left my work in Watford, earned 3 times the money as a duty pilot, and the bonus was that whenever there was a spare aircraft, as long as I got somebody to sit in for me doing the job I did, logging out and logging in aeroplanes as they landed and took off, I was allowed to fly and able to fly a spare aeroplane. And so I got a lot of hours in and had an absolute wonderful time enjoying myself and being paid for it. Anyway, so life went on, and by 1939, of course, we realised from the news that the war was pretty nearly imminent, and so there it was. Suddenly, I was digging trenches. I remember on, I think, September the 3rd, war was declared, and on September the 4th, we started digging. What we were going to use them for, I have absolutely no idea at all. And after that, of course, time went on. They had a lot of pilots, but they hadn't got enough aeroplanes for them. So we sort of formed a group down in Luton town centre, which was an RAF town centre then, and we learnt a great deal about aeroplanes and theory of flight, and every night we were down there enjoying ourselves with our friends, and but unable to fly. Flying stopped for the time being. One after the other of my friends got posted to various squadrons, and I was very jealous of them and very envious of them, until of course the news came back that some of them had been killed in active service already. One was killed, one particular friend of mine was killed flying off the Glorious, one of our aircraft carriers. Anyway, time came, and hopefully I was going to a really super fighter squadron and got a great record from probably the First World War. But no, what happened was apparently, according to the assessments I'd had in my logbook, which seemed to be above average, very different to my school days, I must admit, they decided that they wanted to make me an instructor. So I was pretty angry about this, but didn't have much to say about it. And I was sent down to Uphaven, and the luck that I had there was incredible, because I found that one of the chief instructors down there was the very man who taught me to fly. a short service to retired short service commissioned officer, a Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Jarrett. And so we were firm friends by then, and he guided me right through all the course of learning to be an instructor, and I learnt a very great deal of flying from him. And eventually I was posted to Peterborough as an instructor, and we were then flying Hawker Harts and Fairy Battles. Fairy Battles were ex Battle of France aeroplanes, which were a total failure because they were under-engined and they were shot down in large numbers, and so the RAF very sensibly decided to bring them back, and they turned them into trainers by putting another seat in the back. They weren't the best aeroplanes to fly. We didn't like them very much, but that's what we were given, and so for intermediate flying we used them. After one or two bad difficulties at night flying, because one mustn't forget that the whole country by now was blacked out completely against possibility of enemy bombing. And it was on one occasion when I took a group of pupils over to a satellite aerodrome called Simpson, which is near Peterborough, for night flying, and we were taking off and landing, teaching landing, flying generally, and suddenly we looked up and there was a whole group of bombers coming over, which we realised couldn't be ours. And of course all the whatever lights we had, which were glim lamps mainly, all went out, so we had a very difficult time getting down, and one or two there were quite a few accidents caused by this problem.
Hang on one sec, Tony, sorry, I'm just going to